Hi everyone, welcome to week 7, module 8. This week's lecture has to do with Black African American, primarily United States male artist, and the question of racism and alternative ways of representing oneself through art, which is of course the theme that we've been covering so far. You see on the screen in front of you Glenn Ligon's work. This is a kind of good place to start off thinking about, once again, some of these themes. So, as we go through this lecture, I'll reiterate one more time that it would be really useful to you every once in a while that as I'm lecturing to just pause the lecture and look at the image on the screen and do some decoding of that image, especially with the work of Glenn Ligon and even, for all of the artists. It's essential that you kind of engage with it and think about it. That's what they're asking you to do all the way through. Another kind of note, I've said this before, but if you're wondering why I've chosen the artist that I have chosen amidst a extraordinarily large and interesting field of artists that I could draw from, I've got a couple of things that I'm thinking of. First, these are the artists that over and again, critics and collectors and museums and such have really decided are some of the most interesting and complex artists that one could deal with. And that's one reason, although there are many artists out there that oftentimes are kind of the cream of the crop, so to speak. The other reason that I choose them, though, often has to do with giving you a broad field of different approaches to the same sets of questions or issues. So if I think that, for instance, I have covered all my bases, or at least many of them, with a woman artist earlier in the quarter at this point, then I've decided to show you something a little bit different in these male artists. But of course, you could bring up any number of artists that look quite a lot like earlier artists that we've covered so far. So I thought for today I'd kind of reach back a little bit farther into the historical past than I did with the Black women artists that we were looking at last week. In part to evoke the rich history of Black visual representation, but also to talk about some of the historical factors that have inflected or in one way or another influenced the artists that we'll be covering. And while that would have been a wonderful lecture to provide as well, or backdrop to provide for the women artists that we covered last week, I hope that you're able to take a lot of the information that I covered this week and just kind of think backwards through last week's lecture and apply some of the ideas there. So what you're looking at on the screen right now is a work by Henry Ozawa Tanner called The Thankful Poor from 1894. Henry Tanner was one of a very small number, but significant artist of color of the late 19th century in the United States, who gained a great deal of fame during his own lifetime, although, of course, nothing near his white contemporaries. Henry Tanner was, interestingly enough, a student at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Arts, which in the 19th century was one of two major institutions to the arts here in the United States, the only two really big ones, at least on the East Coast. The other being the National Academy of Design in New York. Henry Tanner, lucky for him, actually entered the school, Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, right around the same time that a famous American artist, white artist in this case, Thomas Akins, started teaching there. And the reason I say that this was fortunate is for those of you who know about Thomas Akins, he was someone who was very egalitarian, very much open to modern ideas, and Henry Tanner was one of his favorite students. By the way, it's worth noting that these types of interest in equality and so forth did not come without their own prices for artists who were not of color as well as those such as Tanner. Thomas Akins, for instance, would lose his position at the Pennsylvania Academy to the Arts for showing nudes to his mixed gender classes. So women weren't allowed to see the male nude, but of course men were. And we've talked about that before. In any case, Henry Tanner then left the Pennsylvania Academy of the Arts and went to Paris to study at the Académie Julienne, where he did very modern paintings. Upon his return to the United States, though, he tended to focus on genre scenes, as was very common, of people of color, his own race, in this case black people, being thankful for what they have, which is a really kind of common theme during the 19th and even early 20th century, to focus on the one hand on the struggles, so in this case poverty, but on the other hand to really extol the virtues of being thankful for what you have and not griping about it. Of course, those ideas are going to change quite a bit during the 1960s and late 60s in particular, all the way up to the Common Age. One more work by Henry Ozawa Tanner here called The Banjo Lesson. Again, we could spend forever on these really interesting works and think about them in relation to the other forms of visual representation of people of color at the time, which is where, the analysis gets most fruitful. In this case, for instance, there are any number of representations of black men or even kids playing music, because one of the kind of favorite representations of African Americans or blacks was to represent them as entertainers. So, for instance, remember in Carl Walker's work, the musicians that show up there in those silhouettes. Commonly, though, the emphasis is on their public persona or them showing themselves to the public, and it's really a representation, oftentimes partaking of various stereotypes done by white artists. What we have here is quite different than those. What we have here is an intimate moment between what one presumes is a grandfather and his grandson learning an instrument and pausing to get it right. And we're given this kind of precious little intimate snapshot of their experience, which is, of course, what he wanted to do, is to really humanize these people rather than set them up as some kind of public persona or stereotype or just the type of the black entertainer. These are real individuals, passing down, in this case, cultural knowledge in the form of music from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next. Another artist, a little bit later in time, of course, we're looking at the famous Jacob Lawrence, who for at least near the end of his life was also an instructor, a professor at the School of Art at the University of Washington. Jacob Lawrence was a part of the Harlem Renaissance, at least as it existed in the 1930s. The vast majority of his works, kind of small-scale works, which you can see all around town, including the Seattle Art Museum, have to do with one of the common kinds of themes of art of this period, in which the new Negro was spoken about quite widely. And that's narrativizing, or in this case, creating visual narratives of the history of blacks and their struggles. And of course, this is a theme that we've seen now a number of times in art that we've been covering, trying to make visible or put into the historical record a history that has not been covered by white patriarchal culture, or what people today would call colonial culture. When I was in high school, it was very infrequent that anyone ever brought up those lost histories of people of color or people of different genders or sexualities. Now it is fairly common to have that discussion in grade school even. And so we see that some things have changed and changed for the better, I would say. In this case, though, all the way through the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s even, Jacob Lawrence was creating series of works that basically were kind of visual records of the trials and difficulties of black culture, but not ever were they representations of the victimhood of people of color in the United States. More often than not, Jacob Lawrence's work is focused on those struggles as something that make people of color stronger, create what my father would have called character in someone, and lead to the possibility of, an as yet realized flowering of Black and African American culture. What you're looking at here on the screen is one of many paintings in the Negro Migration series, created in 1940s, late 30s, early 40s. The Negro Migrations, for those of you who don't know, although hopefully you do since it's in the readings quite a bit, were the movements of people of color from the South to the North, which started even before this, of course, the Civil War, but continued all the way through the 1960s. Mass migrations of people of color from an area of the United States that was deemed to be more racist than the prospects that were in the North. And so here you see a work that says he always has these very long subtitles in these Negro Migration series, and this is, something like, and many people left, and then even more people kept showing up in this one. If you're wondering about the simplicity of the colors here, this is something that he took from his own experience. He believed that this kind of direct representation of very bright and simple colors was something that was a part of his own kind of heritage, both as part of the African diaspora, those who left or were taken more often than not from the African continent and ended up elsewhere, but also his experience, the kind of persistence of those cultural forms in the cultures of the diaspora. So even in Harlem, growing up, seeing very bright, bold colors among the people around him was something that was part of his everyday experience and something that he took to be part of the African-American aesthetic, which then he adopted for his own works. This work is called The Last of the People to Leave, was the African-American Professional, and it documents a historical reality in which people who had attained a certain level of skill not only stayed behind because they had practices and were kind of tied to the area, but because their skills were so needed for people of their own race, their own ethnicities in the South. If they had left, they feel a certain responsibility for taking care of their own, or of people who wouldn't otherwise necessarily be taken care of had they stayed. He also focuses on, in this series, any number of the struggles that Blacks confronted. So one of them are the race riots that occurred in the North, oftentimes in relation to the labor movements. This work in particular has to do with that kind of coincidence, which, by the way, was no coincidence at all, in the figurative sense of Blacks being beaten in the race riots for standing the picket lines and trying to organize labor. Oftentimes the Blacks were put kind of at the forefront of these confrontations, while the whites hovered behind that, even those who were organizing for labor themselves. And this is a historical phenomenon that isn't oftentimes talked about. I made mention of this common theme, not in every person of color's work, but a very kind of consistent theme in the art of the late 19th, early 20th century, is to show how the struggles of people of color lead to the building of strengths, lead to resiliency, lead to a kind of power of its own, which is something that I tried to get to through Bell Hook's reading last week, although from a slightly different, more theoretical angle. This is a work from Jacob Lawrence's Harriet Tubman series called Harriet Grow Bigger, Harriet Grow Stronger. Now, I hope that everyone knows who Harriet Tubman was, the key kind of leader of the Underground Railroad that helped move people of color from the South to the North. Someone who is quite an American hero in most people's minds. And we see her here, cutting wood and getting strong. Now, it's a metaphor, right? The cutting of the wood is, or the struggles that she goes through are the things that are going to give her the resiliency and strength to shoulder the burdens that she'll shoulder through her life to help people who are also struggling because of their skin color, because of their ethnicity, because of racism. When we get into the late 40s, 50s, and 60s, one artist really stands out above the rest, and this artist's name is Romari Bearden. Romari Bearden first started off his artistry working, as so many American artists did during the 1930s and 40s, in the Works Progress Administration, part of FDR's New Deal. For those of you who don't know about the WPA programs, this was a way to put Americans back to work during the Great Depression. And one arm of the WPA was something known as the Federal Arts Project, or the FAP, where Romari Bearden worked alongside many of the white artists who will go on to be the abstract expressionists, such as Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko, and Arshile Gorky and many others. In the 1960s, though, with the rise of the, as the civil rights movement is really gaining momentum, of course it starts in the 50s, Romari Bearden changes the direction of his art pretty dramatically. What you're looking at on the screen here is one of his earliest collages called The Conjure Woman, which will become a trope in his art, a kind of recurrent figure in his art about the black matriarch and the black kind of what was oftentimes called the voodoo woman or the witchy woman. And we'll come back to that idea in a moment here. Let's start with, why he latched on to collage in the first place and what was going on in the late 50s, early 60s when he did this. Now, a big thing in his mind at this point is he has begun studying in the 40s, actually, at the Art Students League in New York with a German Dadaist artist by the name of George Gross, and talking to this artist, and then, of course, invigorated by the civil rights movement, he moves his art away from fairly abstract forms of painting towards something that would have a social purpose, this kind of art that you see on the screen. The Dadaists, of course, were famous for collage work, because the curious thing about a collage, in which you cut up other pieces of material, in this case primarily things out of magazines or photographs, and put them together into a new form, is that they, on the one hand, carry with them the old meanings that they originally have, especially if you can identify them. Like, I can see that these are eyes from a photograph that probably wasn't originally some kind of ritualized woman. So it brings with it the idea of kind of everydayness of a black face and black eyes that have now been reconfigured in this collage to be a construct of this ritualized, very primitive, powerful icon of the black matriarch in society, the black woman who is very closely tied to her historical roots in Africa, despite the diaspora. So, for instance, as Romari Bearden said, there's one of these women, at least in his experience, in just about every neighborhood, who people go to for wisdom, for cures, for, any number of things. And they really are believed to have their own power. They're the strong black matriarch that existed in the tribal societies of Africa before the diaspora, and continue to persist in Western societies today. And he's trying to pay homage to that, and he's trying to create an image that draws together people, and this is not only blacks or people of color, but all people, around the idea of the persistence of these kinds of spiritual figures that exist in everyone's life in one way or another. The photograph as well for him was something in the collage form itself. Were originally inspired by the idea of being collective and collaborative. Again, big watchwords in feminism and big watchwords in any kind of moment of identity politics, the importance of drawing people together. And what I mean by this is that originally these collages were to be put together by numerous hands. He was a member, as you will have read, of the Spiral Group, which was a group built around the idea of the new Negro, mixed together with Leopold Senger's ideas of negritude, which hopefully you've read about at this point, And these artists wanted to create collages as well as other forms collectively and collaboratively so as to build the idea of community. After collages are put together, they're oftentimes photographed again and turned into what is known as a photo montage. Photo montage, specifically speaking in art history, means something that was originally a collage form that has been photographed again so that you can manipulate the negative to make it bigger and to print multiple copies of that image. In general, this artist, Romari Bearden, said, and we'll go into some more of his works, what I've attempted to do in my art is to establish a world through art in which the validity of my Negro experience could live and make its own logic. One of his most famous images from this period, 1964 here, is a work that is known as The Dove. And you can see the dove here up above the central doorway in this picture, which is, again, originally a collage that has been photographed to become a photo montage. This is, in part, an image that draws from his experience of his upbringing in Harlem. And he actually grew up a couple of different places, but his experience of Harlem, both in his childhood as well as his contemporary experience at the neighborhood itself. So it's meant to give you images of the Black experience. And of course, this is a common theme in art, especially during the civil rights movement, of trying to build, and we saw this in feminism, trying to build a community around shared experience, things that look common to people. In this case, it's all a composite. They're all collaged together, so it gives this little kind of wink and a nod to the idea that there's nothing essential about being Black. It is a construct, but it's a construct nonetheless that's governed by shared experience. If there's nothing essential about being a Black person or a Black subject per se, like taking it back to the biological dimension, there's certainly something essential or very common about Black experience, about having the experience, in this case of the inner city, of living in, let's say, perhaps a less affluent part of town, coming up into contact with some of the same characters and the same types of symbols. And so let's just look at a few of these that are pretty common. One is just overall, think about how busy this work is, how many things are crowded into this very shallow space, and how kind of the experience of Harlem or Brooklyn or inner cities is very crowded, very, very dense and very busy and very dynamic. And that's something that he definitely wants to evoke just through the visual qualities of this work. In addition to that, though, if you look very carefully, you start seeing things that, are very particular to the Black experience. Over here in the left-hand upper corner, we see a fist raised in the Black Power salute, that salute that will become so famous during these days. If you look down over here, we see a Black dandy, so the kind of middle right section, with a cigarette in his hand, striding through with his high, heeled, shoes on, looking cool, looking suave, and so forth. And then, of course, right next to him, half veiled, is once again the conjure woman, that kind of mythical woman who's got these connections to Black ancestry, who in this case holds in her hand a staff, something that looks suspiciously like an Odysseus, going all the way back to the Greeks and Ephesus. And of course, that's what we use for our Surgeon General's symbol, those kind of twisted branches together, or in the Odysseus, the twisted snakes. A symbol of healing, a symbol, of course, of medical knowledge and just knowledge in general. In addition to that, though, we also see places that are very kind of common. The front step, which is a place where inner city communities oftentimes meet and talk, and we see people crowded up along this all through the foreground, as well as the balcony up here, which at this point is vacant, but one can imagine another person standing up here and kind of evoking this idea of these brownstones and their front steps and balconies as a place in which communities organize and meet and share ideas. One more work by Romari Bearden here. All of these, by the way, usually have the subtitle, The Prevalence of Ritual. This one's called The Prevalence of Ritual Baptism. And just like with Lois Milo-Jones' work last week, we see a number of West African masks here in the foreground, all made up of composites of actual masks taken from probably National Geographic magazines, mixed together with faces of people of color taken from other magazines to talk about the persistence of the African experience, or the authentic kind of African roots amidst the assimilation into white culture here. In addition, once more, we see up here in the right-hand corner the conjure woman once again. Another artist of roughly the same generation, a little bit younger, and one of my favorites. If you ever get a chance to see John Bigger's work, grew up in Houston, trained in minor art schools in the South. Please take the opportunity. This is just one work by this artist called Shotguns, 7th Ward, Houston, from 1987. Those of you who know parts of the rural South, a shotgun house will be something that's very, very familiar to you. We'll also see further on in this lecture, David Hammons make associations of a house with this type of building itself. A shotgun house is a really simple house, with a big porch on the front, as you see here, clapboard siding, not a lot of windows, usually crowded together in what we would call kind of slum spaces. The 7th Ward in Houston, at the time that he painted this, is of course on the wrong side of the tracks, and you see those railroad tracks here in the foreground. By the way, let me just back up for a minute. This is uncommon, but look up here in the prevalence of ritual of the train here in the background of the top left-hand corner. That's something that Romari Bearden talks about quite a lot in his work as something that, on the one hand, trains were, for him, the white culture, and trains were something that could move you around, push you around, and so forth, but they were also kind of an indication of the separation of ethnicities and races in his life, living on the wrong side of the tracks, of course. And I remember him once saying that, of course, black people were the ones who always lived closest to the trains because they were loud and no one else would want to live there. Sorry for that kind of reversal. So back to John Bigger's work. We see that, train track in the foreground here. We see the shotgun houses here everywhere. But one of the things that John Bigger's came across, and most of the artists you've seen so far at least took one almost obligatory trip to Africa in order to study their historical roots. John Biggers did this a number of times. When he went to Africa, he saw a number of buildings, particularly in West Africa, that looked to him suspiciously like the building forms of the South, and wondered himself, although he didn't need to create some kind of proof for this correspondence, if there was some kind of deep connection or some kind of psychic connection between, people of Africa before and after the diaspora, kind of a historical transcendence through memory of earlier roots. And so we see all these shotgun houses piled up, and on the one hand you're probably thinking overcrowded and victimology, right? They're on the wrong side of the tracks and it's all crowded together, and these are very inexpensive houses, and John Biggers is really trying to point out all the inequities that are especially in terms of the intersections of class and race in the United States, and you wouldn't be wrong there, but he's also trying to give an affirmative dimension to this. In the front of every one of these homes is that black matriarch, not so dissimilar than the figure that Romari Bearden was pointing to in The Conjure Woman. In this case, all of these women's faces have been highly stylized as mass forms from various parts of Africa. And he's trying to really kind of point to the powerful persona of the black woman in black society and their important position within that society as leaders, as, stability factors, as the generators, of course, that actually, the life givers of the African experience. In addition to that, though, he makes this historical parallel. They are all holding these little models of a house in front of them. This is their home. This is their church, so to speak. And those of you who know the history of art, you'll know, of course, that he's pointing towards the way that in Christian society, the Virgin Mary's body is oftentimes understood as similar to, if not the same as, the great cathedrals of the medieval period. It is the reason, by the way, that all of those cathedrals in France are called Notre Dame, which means Our Lady. It was conceived that the church itself was a sacred space, just like the Virgin's body, in which the Spirit of God, existed. And we see that as well here, although the Christian side of things is less dominant than the idea of a connection to primarily West African cultural traditions. In addition to that, though, as well, he's trying to point to the idea of a quilt of common experience. Those, the basic kind of roofs of these houses, their eaves that make these triangular shapes that are all being kind of drawn together is meant to look like a quilt. He once said that, of course, quilts are made of cast-off pieces of material that are then drawn together and turned into something beautiful. And, of course, he's speaking of a metaphor for black culture here, the cast-offs drawing themselves together and making something fresh and new and beautiful out of what was considered not worthy of anyone's attention. We jump now to artists who are basically contemporaries with the black women artists that we covered last week, and without question, the most kind of prominent name among these artists is David Hammons. David Hammons, in this work that you're looking at on the screen called The Injustice Case, kind of broke onto the scene by doing incredibly powerful images, oftentimes very, very big images. So in The Injustice Case, for instance, and this is one of a series of works that he did from his own body prints. Let's start with the actual process here, because that's important. In many of these works, what he would do is either with his own nude body or with a clothed body, he would grease his body up or grease his clothing up and actually imprint his body image either directly on a piece of paper or on a printing plate, and then run that plate through a printing process. The grease then transferred to the paper would be dusted with charcoal, which creates this really ghostly image of what looks like almost a photographic negative there. The reason he does this, it seems to me, is to insist upon the idea of the photograph or the body image as what's known as an indexical sign. Now, we met Semiotics a couple of weeks ago with second-generation feminist artists, and we talked primarily about the linguistic sign, whose, a linguistic sign such as a word or a sound, apple was the example I gave, only has a conventional connection to its referent. You have to learn it. An indexical sign, though, is a type of sign that has a direct existential link to its referent. So, for instance, anything that you think of as forensic, a fingerprint, a footprint, a mark on the wall, or in this case, a body imprint, or even a photographic negative, which is created, at least before digital photography, where light is allowed through an aperture to imprint itself or to distort the photographic negative. It can only be created by that direct contact. Now, the reason that the indexical sign is so important here is that indices are taken to be truth, right? Think of forensic evidence and how much truth validity we put in a piece of forensic evidence. They are the truth. They are created, these signs are created literally by a direct contact with their referent point. And I think he's wanting to point that out. Whether he's saying that what he's pointing out here is the truth, or whether he's trying to make us think about these types of signs that exist in the world that we take to be truth, we take to be documentary evidence, but maybe shouldn't be, is something that I think you should stop and think about, because it's not clear to critics which side he stands on here. Now let's go on to the imagery itself. The Injustice case is a work of art that is very directly connected to a rather infamous historical moment. These body print series all were. In this case, the Injustice case from 1970 harks back 2 years earlier to the Democratic National Conventions that were held in Chicago that year in 1968, that were the site of numerous race riots and, of course, civil rights protests. And they were really, and think of 1968, right? The height of the civil rights movement, the height of Black Power, the height of a lot of social unrest, and kind of the tail end of the peaceful moment of the civil rights movement, where, of course, with the rise of Black Power and the Black Panther movement, many people of color were just fed up, and they were, as the slogan goes, going to attain freedom by any means necessary. So in this case, the specific moment of the Democratic National Convention that this is referring back to was the so-called infamous case of the Chicago 8. 8 people of color were charged by the federal government with inciting riots and civil unrest, and were brought to federal trial. That was very much a kind of drawing point for any number of people around the question of what role the federal government was playing in institutionalizing racism. And this trial really drew together people and frankly separated people, both of Black descent as well as white Americans, around the question of how prevalent racism was in the United States. In this famous trial, one of the most notorious of the defendants was a man by the name of Bobby Seale, who was a co-founder of the Black Panthers movement, who was so vociferous during his trial that he was, in the end, charged with 16 counts of contempt for speaking when he wasn't supposed to be speaking, for rising up and speaking out against injustice in his trial. Every one of those counts, by the way, he got 3 months in prison for as well. And at a particular moment in the trial, the white judge forced him to be bound and gagged. So bringing up the question of, the right of free speech and other things, it was just a kind of very pointed moment in the civil unrest and race relations in the United States in the late 1960s. Of course, David Hammons then figures this for us, and then around the edges of this, you see that red, white, and blue flag, although now inverted kind of backwards, which raises the question of who does this flag actually protect? Whose free speech is protected by the flag, and who gets power in the United States and who is subject to that power in the United States. What David Hammons is best known for, though, is to taking and creating sculptures, or frankly even installations, out of everyday objects that are made to raise our awareness of the persistence of inequities and racism in the United States. I remember the very first time that I saw one of these. I didn't know who the artist was at the time. I didn't know what this was really even all about. It's David Hammons' famous spade with chains here. So when I saw it, I probably just thought, oh, it's one of those kinds of, junk sculptures that got so famous in the 1960s and 70s. And to some degree that's true, but of course it has resonances with its meaning that are very closely tied to the persistence of racist language in the United States that maybe goes unacknowledged. So for instance, last time around we looked at Betty Saar's The Liberation of Aunt Jemima, and I asked you to think a little bit about what we do with images or language that is clearly racist and understood as racist by some, but maybe has such a distance from its originary racist moment that many people in society no longer recognize it as racist. In this case, a spade, above and beyond being a digging implement, was a pejorative term used to designate black men. So to call a spade, which is something that I remember even in my very liberal and multiracial household was thrown around quite a bit as just saying you call something like it is, has a different racist tone to it if you know that history to the term spade. He also, of course, uses chains here to evoke that idea of being tied to one's legacy and slavery and the persistence of those feelings in the present, which is something that can't be under-acknowledged. I hear all the time people say, and I think with a moderate degree of frustration and maybe not a lot of self-reflection, when people bring up the persistence of issues that go all the way back to slavery, something like, well, just get over it, right? Slavery was over 200 years ago, just get over it. But the thing is that, what do you mean by just get over it? How do these deep histories continue to inform the present? And what does it mean to be part of a legacy that goes back to a moment in which you were owned by someone else? And those are the types of questions that this work is meant to evoke. In addition to that, though, David Hammons is hardly ever just about some kind of overt critique. He oftentimes has something in the work that is meant to be an affirmation. So I don't know if you can see it here in this image, but the shovel handle or the shovel face itself looks a little bit like an African mask, and it is meant to. He actually inscribed on the face of this a little bit of eyes and a nose right in the middle here. You can probably just make these things out so as to evoke that kind of history from Black culture as well. And here he is sitting next to two of these where you can see the face on one of these quite a bit better, and they look a little bit like a mask from the past, as well as evoking the history of slavery and the persistence of racist language. So many, and we saw this with Faith Ringgold, so many people of color, different ethnicities, and frankly, even different sexualities will use the American flag as a point of reference for inequalities and inequities in the United States. This is certainly something that David Hammons will return to again and again. He famously changed the red, white, and blue into what he called the PanAfrican Flag, or the African American flag, which you see here. There are many different copies of this. And, again, this tends to, depending upon your upbringing, really upset particular groups of people in the United States because, they don't want the myth of, I suppose, America as being an equitable society to go away. And the red, white, and blue is, has a lot of, as does the United States, a lot of really good things going for it. But it also has a deep history of segregation and racism as well. And that's one of the points of reference that this visual icon is meant to call forth for everyone. It is, on the one hand, a critique of the idea that the red, white, and blue protects everyone equally. It is also a nod towards fears that primarily white Americans have about segregation working the opposite way around, by which I mean blacks self-segregating, separating themselves from white culture, not being willing to be a part of that, supposed melting pot and what that calls forth for people. These Pan-African colors are not only colors that you see very prominent in different West African nations, They are also symbolic, although the symbolism, as you've heard Thelma Golden talk about or write about, is a little bit slippery. So, for instance, the red oftentimes is said to refer to the hardships that people of color, particularly blacks, have confronted through the ages, all the blood shed, for instance. The black is pretty straightforward. That's the adoption of the idea of one's skin pigmentation being a form of identity, blackness. And the green is the fertile field of the tomorrow, the as yet realized possibilities and beauties of black culture. David Hammons is all over the place in his work, but one of his most famous projects is this one that you see in completion here called Higher Goals, which necessitates a kind of long narrative. For those of you who don't know, many times artists are drawn into situations known as residencies, where they'll go work for an organization over the course of months to come up with a work of art at the end, but also to work with local communities as they're in these residencies. This is one such situation. Higher Goals came from a residency, I believe it's in Brooklyn, where he did this originally. And what he does in these situations that he's found himself in these situations a number of times over his artistic career is to go meet with the community and kind of wander around and see who he's producing for, try to figure out what he's going to do for this community. This work was something that was created in 1986, and as he is wandering around this, inner city kind of black neighborhood, he kept coming across young, primarily black men who were, and by black men I mean boys, right? Many of these are kids, anywhere from 8 years to 16, 17 years old, playing basketball on the community outdoor basketball courts. When, as far as he could tell, they should have been in school, right? It's being during school hours and they're all out playing basketball. And he would go talk to these boys and say, hey, what are you up to? Why aren't you in school? And they'd say, and this is a paraphrase of many conversations that he had, I don't need to be in school. I'm going to make it big. I'm honing my game. I'm going to go play for the NBA and make a lot of money that way. And of course, his initial response was, come on, get realistic. And he at least according to one interview I remember hearing, he said this to the first few groups that he came across and got, it fell on deaf ears. They weren't listening to him at all. And so he decided that as a part of his project, what he would do is try to develop a work of art around this theme to get young black men to realize higher goals than the aspirations that they had at that moment. We'll see later on the quarter another artist who deals with these same questions out of Vancouver, although from the standpoint of a Native American culture as well. So what he did then was to meet with these kids, and in the development of his work and coming up with his ideas, he talked to them about statistics, first of all, the number of people who actually will make the NBA and what the possibilities are there. He also, though, asked them to contribute to this project, first of all, by picking up primarily bottle caps around the neighborhood that they could find and talking to him about the beautification of materials in African culture. And then in the end, what he did was he created these glorious basketball hoops that are set on telephone poles that range in size anywhere from 20 to 30 feet or so much higher than the 10-foot hoop that you're expecting, that are completely covered with designs that are taken out of, they're kind of a modernized version of various African designs that you might find on poles or on houses or what have you, but made out of the detritus of an area, right? These are primarily bottle caps that you see everywhere. And he used this as a talking point for these young black men about not trying to talk them out of their goals of being an NBA player, but telling them to set their goals high, right? Whatever those goals are, set them high and go for them, but don't just get locked into one. So this community project, in a way, became not only an emblem of the idea to exhort young black men to have even higher goals than they had so far imagined, but a catalyst for conversations about what young black men might also do, in addition to trying to become great NBA stars like Michael Jordan, who was the main person to emulate it during this age. Then he reprised this a number of years later with this one, and you'll hear Thelma Golden, of course, talk about Bling Culture as well as many others. This is called Bling Bling Basket. And, in a way, take it any way you want. I've always just waited to come across this in like an MTV version of Cribs, where you go to Shaquille O'Neal's house or something and see this is actually in his full-size gym in his house. But it's just this, totally beautified basketball hoop with chandeliers and things that look like gemstones everywhere. And it, for me, evokes the idea of, the heroization of the black athlete, which on the one hand is this wonderful phenomena, right? The achievements of these extraordinary athletes. And on the other hand, the difficulties that this then holds for others who aspire to this condition of the black athlete. And let's face it, world-class athletes are limited. There aren't going to be that many of them. But the great kind of pull that this goal has for so many, because of not only all the attention one gets, but all the money, the wealth that comes along with this. And how is that money being put to use? And, like so many of David Hammons' works, these are catalysts for conversations around the question of, the exuberant kind of excess of the black athlete when he shows off for his communities, as well as, the right to indulge in whatever one wants when one attains a particular, in this case, class status in society. So one more work by David Hammons, and this, again, is a community project that was actually created for a art festival in South Carolina, in Charleston. This is a work that is called American Street House of the Future from 1991. It's a 6-month-long project, and what you're looking at is right in the center here is the house that he had built for his part of the project. This was the Spoleto Festival is a festival in which the entire small historical town of Charleston became a site of numerous installations by artists of international fame, not only people of color, but very, very well-known installation artists. And this is David Hammons' contribution to this. For his contribution, what he built is something that looks surprisingly like a shotgun house. It's what's called a skinny house in South Carolina, and it's something that you find primarily in the black parts of town. For those of you who haven't been to South Carolina before, or Charleston in particular, it's a very, very historical town, and it's deeply racially segregated still, with parts of town that are quite kind of Southern genteel society, very polite and very kind of well-mannered, very, I would say, politically correct. And then you cross into another particular zone and you see run-down, ramshackle houses that are for the working poor, many of whom are people of color. He, for his project, took over a corner lot. That was important to him. The site was very important. The corner lot is usually a zone restricted for a business. I remember seeing Charleston, the first time around, and every single corner seems to have a house mixed with a business, some kind of small little store associated with it. It's a gathering place then for the community to come around the front of the store and get something to drink or eat and kind of stand around there, like we would say today in the office, around the water cooler. In this case, you hang out at the corner store and talk, what's going on in your local community. So he took over this abandoned lot and got an architect to build this building. I'll show you a couple close-ups of this, which is an amalgam of just about every style of architecture that you can find in this part of town. So the skinny house, the very kind of common classical columns, various entablatures, the raking cornice here, the second story with the stairs that go up from the outside. So it's to save space. And you could go on and on with this, but it's basically a kind of historical record of every single style of building in this part of town. It's meant to evoke that idea of historical memory. It is a working space, by the way. An artist actually has a studio here even today and continues to work. So in addition to that, which is supposed to kind of give a visual image to the history of Black culture in South Carolina, this was also a space in which he, drew together the community. What you see here is a very famous poem by a Black academic poet that says, "The Afro-American has become heir to the myths." I'm going to get you up close so you can read this with me. "Heir to the myths that it is better to be poor than rich, lower class than middle or upper, easygoing rather than industrious, extravagant rather than thrifty, athletic rather than academic." And again, this is a catalyst for a conversation around why that is the case. And if it is true, is that the stereotype that has been inherited by young Blacks, and is this something to discuss further? On the other side of this little plaque, you see the red in the foreground that speaks about the project, and a photograph of the young Black kids that gathered around here to hear him talk about his project that has now been turned into a kind of mini billboard. And what they're all looking at in the distance, or the way that he set this up, is the Afro-American flag here. A very complicated artist to deal with, but one that I couldn't pass up because he represents something quite different than most of what we've seen before, although you might think about Barbara Kruger here a little bit, is the artist Glenn Ligon. Glenn Ligon works primarily with words. He comes out of the tradition of the so-called conceptual art movement of the late 1960s, where a lot of artists were using words in their works of art. In his case, the words that you'll see on these canvases are taken from other sources. These are not things that he generates himself. It's something that he takes from various other writers or even media sources. So, for instance, here you see these famous stenciled letters. And by the way, he always uses stenciling because he wants to leave these open to your own interpretation. He feels like if he turned this into, let's say, cursive writing, it would be too much his own. So he wants it to have the type of objective status of not being anyone's writing, just being out there for people to take into consideration. You see here work that's called Too White, Too Black from 1992. And by the way, he's been working all the way through the 80s, 70s, 80s. But in this case, I thought it'd be best to start off with this because you can see what he's up to here. At the very top, you see the repeated phrase, "I do not always feel colored." And then as it continues to repeat, it breaks down both because of the places that he splits the words, but also because of the kind of continuing encroachment of black against the white near the bottom. So I do not always feel colored. Try to read this through, by the way, on your own. I do not always feel colored. I do not always feel color red. I do not always feel colored. And then it keeps breaking down. One of the things that he's trying to point to is, of course, the way that otherness works. To say that someone's black is to juxtapose them or at least implicitly compare them to the alternative whiteness. So the white and the black here in the stenciling, as it breaks down, doesn't allow us to read or, make legible blackness. Blackness only works against whiteness, just as the idea of white identity only works against the otherness of blackness. That's the way that definitions work, right? They work by, identity always works by claiming not only what one is or what one aspires to be, but by contrasting oneself against one's other, what one is not. So let's move to the next one, right? I feel most colored when I'm thrown against a sharp white background, and then watch this break down too. In other words, one of the things that he's dealing with over and again in his work is the way that language is used to both perpetuate as well as to produce various stereotypes of otherness, or what he calls outsider status himself. I should say, although I'm not sure it's so important for the lecture today, that beyond being a black man, he's also a gay man. And some of his work, although not the work that I'm showing you today, deals with the way that his own queer sexuality doesn't jive well with the heterosexual world out there, and how he feels doubly marginalized for that as well. When you see these on the wall, you see exactly how they perform the very meaning that he's getting at. At the top, you can read them. By the bottom, you can barely read anything, and the struggle to make sense of the difference between white and black word and its backdrop is even harder than one would think. One of the things that we oftentimes hear in the discourse around Glenn Ligon's work is the idea of the legibility of race. I made mention of this last week at the beginning of the lecture, that race is a contested category itself. There is no purity of the races, which begs the question why we separate them in the first place. But even further, how black do you have to be black? How white do you have to be white? How do we read the middle zones? What exactly is black? What is meant by that? Who gets to decide what that is, and so on and so forth? These are all questions that his work tries to call forth for us. You will have read a little bit about this work. This is a work called White, or it comes from the series known as White. This is White number 1. It's a series that was based upon a trial of young, primarily black men, although if I remember correctly, there were at least some that were of Hispanic descent, in a trial about a rape that occurred in Central Park of a white woman. And so for this series, and frankly many other series, you're going to see the profile series here coming up as well, he takes various statements that are heard in the media or heard in trials, and he just crops them out from the overall context in which they were spoken and puts them on these panels for our reading and for our own kind of contemplation in the museum. And we're to make sense of these. We're to put them together. And just like I said way back there with Yoko Ono's work, the key dimension to these works is that they are performative. We perform the meaning. And as we reflect on the various things that this kind of verbiage calls up for us, we think about our own implication in stereotypes, or we think about the stereotypes that are around us and how they affect us or don't, or, in one way or another inflect our own lives. So read through this. Think about this for a minute. What does it mean to read here? Thinking about, this being a profile of a black man or of a trial, of course, marked as not there, up hands, about white, or in the profile series proper here from 1990 to 91, we see this specifically about the Central Park rape trial of these 5 black men, or men of color. These are, by the way, in this case, in the profile series, only statements that were taken out of media sources, not the trial itself. And so they're part of that phenomena in which the news media really tries to delve into the personal stories of these people. And as you will have read, one of the curious things about these is that something that becomes clear in these many kinds of profiles that he does is that the complexity of these people's lives starts to show through. It turned out that in this case, although at the time that he's working on this, I don't believe he knew this, that these men ended up being probably innocent, even though they served many years in prison for it. A serial rapist eventually admitted perpetrating the crimes. So read through this, right? These are words taken from the New York Times primarily that complicate the version of events of these being just black, evil men perpetrating a crime, a very horrendous crime against a white woman, and instead start to both partake of stereotypes as well as open up into greater complexities of the people that they're supposedly profiling. Of course, the title itself, Profile, is something that he wants you to think about as well. It's one of those really difficult questions in our society. In what way is profiling in any way productive, and what are all the ways that it is destructive, particularly when it comes to policing culture and surveillance culture and all of the things that we've unfortunately become all too aware of in the last few years about the use of force against young, primarily black men in our world. So pause this here and just read through this. Of course, they get more black, where you start to see a face in the words, and then you start thinking about the way that language inscribes various bodies with meaning, that all the words and all the stereotypes that we've read and uttered start to become the way that we see people. This is the work, you can't even read this, but for those of you who've been to the Seattle Art Museum, you'll know of this work. This is a study for one of those series that has to do with the writings of James Baldwin. James Baldwin, a very famous black queer artist, gay artist, I guess it was before the word queer was really invented, oftentimes in his essays and his books speaks about, in very elegant ways, what it feels to be an outsider in the world. And this is one of the sources to which Glenn Ligon continually kind of returns to in his own work. The other is Frantz Fanon. A couple of simpler things to kind of end up with today. In this case, you're looking at the work of Robert Colescott. Robert Colescott, just like we saw in Betty Saar's work, is really messing around with the idea, and Faith Ringgold, frankly, in some ways, messing around with the idea of stereotypes by turning them into their kind of grotesque equivalents, or in this case, inverting a famous painting by Emanuel Lutz called George Washington Crossing the Delaware into a work that he calls George Washington Carver Crossing the Delaware, a page from American history. This was painted, by the way, in 1975. He gets into a lot of trouble. So what we're doing here is we've replaced all the characters from this famous painting, which you see on the top by this 19th century German-born American painter, with a scene in which the very famous black inventor, George Washington Carver, has now taken command of the boat that's crossing the Delaware, but his motley crew is drinking moonshine and it's all blackface and, all these stereotypes, playing the banjo, playing the harmonica. One guy's fishing at the foreground, the other guy's your typical kind of baker. All the stereotypes of blackness are in here. In order to poke fun at those stereotypes. He takes a lot of heat for this. They're funny on the one hand, but they've got this kind of biting humor to them. Like, why is this funny exactly? And what does it mean to laugh in front of this? And the kind of most vociferous critics against him state, and it's a common criticism of those who deal with stereotypes, that he is inscribing through his art the various stereotypes that he seeks to confront. But I would say there's a little beyond that. Just like the liberation of Aunt Jemima, it's impossible to see that Emanuel Lutz painting again after you've seen this one without thinking, wow, there's not a person of color in that boat. There's not a person of color even marked in the Revolutionary War, even though people of color fought in that. So what does that mean? Or one of my personal favorites, this is Robert Colescott's work called Eat Dem Taters, which is, of course, a reprise of Vincent van Gogh's famous The Potato Eaters, which I'm showing you a sketch of up above here, which is all about community and values and so forth. But in this case, you see that stereotypical grotesque again represented. This is an artist who is a British artist who actually grew up in Nigeria. His name is Yinka Shonibare. And what you're looking at here is a work called Diary of a Victorian Dandy, 1900 Hours. He works with photography and installations. And I brought this in really to preface the work of Kehinde Wiley, who we're going to finish off with today. But just to show you a precedent for this. So Yinka Shonibare oftentimes will play the part of either a bewigged or very kind of glamorously dressed 18th century kind of Englishman amidst these fawning white women all around him and white men to kind of invert the roles of race in history. In other words, what does it feel like to see a person of color in the role of the Victorian dandy? Comfortable in his abode with all the women fawning over him when he is actually a person of color, and to evoke the deep kind of history of colonialism in Britain during his own time period. The work that the Seattle Art Museum owns is this work called Nuclear Family, in which he does something that's very uncommon in his work. He takes these mannequins and dresses them in clothing styles that look like the Victorian age. So the age of, the vastest expanses of colonialism in Western Europe, particularly in the British Empire, right? The age of the mass colonization, although it had started as early as the late 1300s of Africa, and the kind of splitting up of the African continent into all of these countries that we see today, which never existed in the form that they do pre-colonial contact. So the dress style looks like that, and the nod to the idea of the nuclear family, the Western notion of the family with a father and a mother and two perfect children here, is kind of icon of the West. But the curious thing about this is that the fabrics that he uses here look like African fabrics, don't they? They look like something that you might find in one of the West African countries which he grew up in. But they're not. They're actually what are known as Dutch wax print textiles. This is something that just take this to heart. There are so many situations in which this occurs. These fabrics were produced in the Netherlands through a very particular process during the age of colonialism, and then sold back to African nations and then become a part of those nations as if they were authentically from those nations. And we see that type of situation occurring both ways. Many of the African sculptures, particularly of West Africa, that we think of as African, are actually products of the so-called tourist trade that goes all the way back to the 14 and 1500s. I bring that up, though, to kind of end with the work of a very hot artist today, Kehinde Wiley. Kehinde Wiley is a classically trained, very gifted portraitist artist primarily, but he does something really curious in his portraits that has got him a lot of attention. And at the time, of course, of the recording of this lecture, there's a huge exhibition of Kehinde Wiley's work at the Seattle Art Museum called A New Republic. So what Kehinde Wiley got very famous for, and by the way, his father is an African man who he was estranged from, who he went in the 1990s to visit and to learn his African heritage. What Kehinde Wiley does most notably is he takes black men who he has encountered in his own life, usually just by walking the streets, so everyday people is his most common topic. He invites them back to his studio, where he shows them textbooks of kind of famous portraits of people of the past. He asks them to pick a portrait, and then he paints their portrait in the manner of these great portraits of Western figures of the past. So in this case, I kind of got up close on this. What you're seeing is a portrait of this black man sitting astride a horse. By the way, the backgrounds of these incredibly decorative kind of wallpapers are usually taken from the homes of people who would have hung such portraits. They're of roughly the age of these people, or you'll see a lot of kind of flora in the background of these pictures that are very much about these kinds of Victorian interiors or neoclassical interiors. You see this man here astride the horse, but the thing that hasn't changed from the original photo is the horse. Everything else has. The pose is the same as the original picture, but the clothing is all contemporary clothing. So he's wearing his camouflage fatigues. He's wearing his nubuck boots. He's wearing his do-rag in his hair and so forth. But beyond that, his pose on the horse is something that's taken out of a famous picture by Jean-Auguste Dominique. No, I'm sorry, this is Jacques-Louis David's famous picture of Napoleon. So going back to this original picture again, close here on it again, we see him do something that's pretty interesting. He's inverted the great portrait of Napoleon done by the great neoclassical artist Jacques-Louis David by taking over the position of this court painter, which Jean-Auguste Dominique Ang, the original portraitist, was. He's taken over that role, and the person that he is glorifying is not the megalomaniac Napoleon, but rather this everyday Joe that he's encountered on the street, adopting the heroic pose of the conquering leader in this picture that is known as Napoleon leading the army over the Alps from 2005. You see in the foreground, I'm just going to move this up a little bit, you see in the foreground of this painting, these names that are on the original painting itself: Bonaparte, Hannibal, Charlemagne, or Carolus Magnus here. These are all great kind of Western leaders who have conquered various parts of Europe. And then the name of the contemporary portrait here, Williams. The other thing, though, that is occurring here is really interesting as well. He's extraordinarily gifted, portraitist. So these are hyper-real photographs of these figures. Is that he's really adopting the old style of the famous Western artist who represents, in collaboration with his sitter, people exactly the way that they want to see themselves in the world, right? A portrait is always the way that we represent ourselves to the world and to ourselves, the way that we claim our own forms of identity. But he does it by adopting these or asking people to pick a glorified picture from the past and to kind of put themselves into that role. So on the one hand, as an artist, he is playing the role of the very vaunted humanistic subject, the artist who is, one of the most kind of gifted members of society. And his figures, everyday people, adopt the roles of these glorified people of the past, sometimes great leaders, other times objects of desire, such as this one here. This is a painting that's called Femme piquée par un serpent, which means a woman bitten by a serpent. It comes from this famous neoclassical sculpture here, incredibly eroticized figure of a woman who's been bit on the heel by a serpent and is wreathing, supposedly in pain, but it's really about eroticism and desire. But we've got a young black male here. Now, the best thing about this, of course, is that he's wearing all of the icons of the young black male, the printed hoodie, the baseball cap kind of off to the side, the low-rise jeans here with the tighty-whities showing up above them and his white sneakers down below. He's wearing all the kind of fetishized objects of the young black male, but he's partaking in the image of the objectified female here. behind it, which raises another question about this artist's work. Kennedy Wiley many of his works kind of are rife with things that seem very homoerotic, and it's curious to wonder about how those play to various different types of viewers who shuffle up in front of these images of these figures. And I just wanted you to see the scale of these two. They are oftentimes monumental works. So he's not only adopted the poses and the subjects of earlier artists, he's also adopted the grand historical scale of glorified images of people of color, in this case. This is the work that is slated for gift for the Seattle Art Museum. So I just kind of show you this. You may have seen this before. Another one of these just to show you more images of this, wearing contemporary clothing, but partaking of the glorified poses of past figures. And then it's not only everyday Joes. Now that he's gotten very famous, of course, every major icon of Black culture has sat for a portrait here. So we see a Jean-Auguste Dominique Eng work of Napoleon on the right again, and over on the left is Ice-T. Well, thanks for listening this week. Hopefully you will stop and kind of pause with a lot of these images and think your way through them. I will be asking a question on the quiz that has you really analyze one work for that quiz from both the Black women artists as well as the Black male artists. And I'll see you next week.